really appreciate this opportunity to be able to speak today on Professor Govind Chandra Pandey's 98th birthday. Um, I knew him for many years, but a few words on his career. A historian by profession, Professor Pandey was an original thinker, a philosopher, and poet with more than 60 books and 100 research papers in English, Hindi, and Sanskrit. His very first book, Studies in the Origin of Buddhism, was described by the Journal of German Oriental Society in 61 as the best work on the subject in the previous 20 years. His philosophical writings, Mulya Mimamsa, received the Union Government Prize as an original Hindi work on philosophy. Um, and Bharatiya Parampara ke Mool Swar won him the first Shankar Award. His three works in Sanskrit, Bhakti Darshan Vimarsha, Saundarya Darshan Vimarsha, and Ekam Sad Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, discussed the philosophy of bhakti. Um, and then he also wrote two books on Shankaracharya, and his Sahitya, Saundarya, and Sanskriti received the Murti Devi Award. His meaning and process of culture and his foundations of Indian culture present culture as the unity of vision. Now, as far as I'm concerned, my many interactions with him were as his role as editor in the many volumes of Science, Philosophy, and Culture, where uh, where he wrote or edited the books on early Indian era as far as culture was concerned. In 2004, he received the Saraswati Samman for his Sanskrit poems, and his Vedic Sanskriti and translation and interpretation of the Rig Veda in 10 volumes synthesize both Western and Indian explorations on the deeper meaning and how it can be meaningfully translated. He served as the head of several prestigious institutes, including the Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla, and received several awards, including the Padma Shri in 2010. So I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak on a topic on which he and I had some conversations and which he would have appreciated, because we live in the most interesting times where science has reached a point where it seems to offer us all kinds of opportunities of transforming our lives and living well, but at the same time, it faces the greatest dangers, both from the perspective of relationship to society and also within its own foundations. And I say all this to make the case that it's precisely for these reasons that we need to take a very serious look at India's own tradition of knowledge, which the great German historian of art, Heinrich Zimmer, in a book that he wrote on Indian art history in the early 50s, before he died tragically very young, he said that, and I'm paraphrasing him, he said that India puzzles and probably scares the Westerner, because what the West has come to face at that point, which is 70 years ago, is things that Indian sages wrote at the banks of the Ganges or Ganga 2,500 years prior, that how could this have happened, and where is it that India lies now, because certainly India 70 years ago was in a pretty precarious economic situation. So we need to square these opposites related to human condition, and also where India stands in the midst of that. Now, what is happening as far as AI is concerned? Well, AI is transforming life in all the different ways that one can imagine. And each one of us already knows how social media is changing us and connecting us across the continents, and bringing us information. But at the same time, we also know that this is led to concentration of power, and people can be canceled if what one wants to say goes counter to what the elites want, as we saw when the former president of the US, Donald Trump, was thrown off the various social media networks. So all this can happen. That's one side to it. The other side of AI is that its pervasive automation is unstoppable, and more and more jobs will be permanently lost across the world. And we are seeing examples of it, for example, in Britain, where there are more than 1,000 centers that have cropped up across the country, where people are given supplies for home and toothpaste and this and that, because jobs are gone. And this creates a lot of challenges. The other side to it is that people are imagining that computers eventually will become conscious. And if they become conscious, and this will happen, this is how people look at it, that the more computers are able to emulate the processes in the brain and in one's consciousness, one would be able to create what are called EMS, 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 which are emulators of each individual. And these EMS could be stored in powerful computers, and then they could be later on embodied. And therefore, in this particular sense, humans will become immortal. And this, with some wryness, one can recall the famous shlok in Ishavasya Upanishad, where it's stated that vinashena mrityu tirtva sambhutinam amritam ashnute. Or from avidya you get immortality. You from avidya you overcome death, which is something like this. And with vidya, which is deeper knowledge of consciousness, you get immortality. But it's really not quite so, because there was a high level committee created in the US a couple of years ago of some leading scientists from across many different disciplines, including computer science, physics, neuroscience, philosophy, and so on. And we met several times. I was a member of this committee, and the committee was tasked with this question of whether computers of the future, not necessarily short-term future, even 50 years from now or 1,000 years from now, would become conscious. And the opinion was divided. There were some who thought that they would become conscious, and these were generally people who do computer science or materialists, or some of them were Buddhists. And the others who were into quantum theory or who were Vedantins. These were the two philosophical thoughts, and these were all Americans and Europeans, excepting me. The two philosophical thoughts outside of those who are hard-boiled scientists were either Vedanta or Buddhism. And within Buddhism, the idea, people, and these were of course not very knowledgeable about Buddhism, the whole idea of shunyata, if there is shunyata, if there's nothingness, and if consciousness arises within us, likewise it could arise in computers as well. While on the other hand, those who do Vedanta or quantum mechanics, their whole idea is that the observer is always apart from the physical system. And in fact, two things. Quantum mechanics is the deepest scientific theory there is. And secondly, one of the two creators of quantum mechanics, the Austrian Erwin Schrödinger, was actually a Vedantin. And in his own autobiography, he says that the central idea of quantum mechanics to him, which is the idea of superposition, that exclusive things can coexist at the same time, he claimed came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman, which is this small thing within each individual, is the entire cosmos, is a sum of all possibilities. So, to this extent, Indian knowledge system underlies the deepest scientific theory already, although many people in India don't know it. But Westerners are quite aware that Vedanta has played a very central role in the development of science in quantum mechanics. But now, as science stands, well, first of all, two things happened. After the Second World War, um, because Schrödinger was a German speaking guy and most of the creators of quantum mechanics were from Europe, there was a reaction after the Second World War. And a lot of philosophers of science or interpreters of quantum mechanics have tried to give it an interpretation where there could be an explanation for observers also in terms of quantum mechanics, but it really hasn't worked. And the orthodox interpretation, where consciousness is always apart, observers are always apart from the material system, still is the majority view. So, but in spite of this, uh, science as it stands now, uh, in its own foundations, has reached a crisis point. And one aspect of it is that um, um, Einstein's theory of gravitation or Newtonian theory of gravitation doesn't work when we look at cosmology. You're not able to explain the motions of galaxies and stars. And therefore, science has been forced to postulate 96% of physical reality in terms of dark matter and dark energy, for which there is not a shred of evidence. Even though people have been looking for it, there is no evidence whatsoever until now for either dark matter or dark energy. You know, it's like people in the past invoking ghosts to explain certain processes they did not understand. So this is a crisis. In fact, right now, all of physics is based on 0.5%, 0.5% of the observable universe. If you accept this 90% reckoning, because you have 96% dark matter and dark energy, and 3.5% interstellar gases, which you cannot see. So that takes care of 99.5%. So the actual physical universe that you see or astronomers see is only 0.5%. And clearly, if there is no evidence of it, there is probably more likelihood that the whole framework has a problem. And we need to relook physics from a new perspective, just as 100 years ago, before the birth of quantum mechanics, physics had to be relooked because they could not explain why the electrons moving around the nucleus in an atom did not fall into the nucleus because their charges are different. The nucleus is positive, the electrons are negative, the electrons should collapse into the nucleus. And for that, uh, quantum mechanics had to be needed. So maybe we need something else. And, uh, and that's where Indian knowledge system should come in, and I would make a case for it. But now, two other elements. You have computer science, and the silicon machine is not conscious, while the neuron machine inside the brain is conscious. So why is it that one of them is not and the other is? And the idea is that maybe it's just complexity, but once again, no evidence for it. Third is neuroscience itself. All the research that's been done to look for neural correlate of consciousness. And you can look for it using functional MRI, for example. You have a subject and he's all instrumented up, and you look at which points or parts of the brain light up based on various cognitive tasks the subject is doing. And what they find is that there is no single module which lights up when a person is doing cognition. It can be all scattered all over the brain randomly, so to speak. And therefore, the conscious self seems to be missing inside the brain. Of course, there is a correlation. It's somewhat like a simple minded example that is given is like a radio receiver receives all the signals and is able to produce sound, etc. But the sound does not actually come from within the radio receiver, but you do need the circuitry. And likewise, you do need the circuitry of the brain. If it's broken due to a stroke or injury, then clearly consciousness doesn't work. But if it's all intact, but it doesn't truly reside, consciousness doesn't truly reside. And philosophically, the creators of quantum mechanics spoke of something called a parallelism that exists between the physical system and consciousness, and that creates philosophical problems about how do the two interact with each other. So this is sort of the setting then for me to introduce where India can come in, or Indian knowledge can come in, just as it did already come in 100 years ago in the great work of Schrödinger in his creation of quantum mechanics, or prior to that also 1850. India played a central role in the development of modern science. In 1850s, there were three Englishmen who created what is called mathematical logic theory, or mathematical machine theory. And these three were Charles Babbage, um, and two others, and George Boole and De Morgan, Augustus De Morgan. Now, they created that, and Charles Babbage even tried to create a digital mechanical computer. And that's why some people call Charles Babbage the father of computer science or computer machines. And as we know, computers are at the basis of all that has changed in our modern world, not only in our use of social media, but in all the machines that are run by it. And more in AI, these machines can work autonomously, and therefore this scepter of machines being everywhere, and what are humans to do if they have no jobs, which is of course the cultural and social element to deal with society related to knowledge, which is something that Professor Pandey had thought about quite deeply and spoke in his book on the Vedas. But now let me go back to the story of 1850s. George Boole died soon afterwards, late 1850s. He died somewhat young, but his wife was a well-known science writer herself. And in 1898, she wrote a very famous essay going back over the development of that mathematical logic or machine theory. And she said, look, we should also give credit to India. And this is, of course, quite a surprise, because her uncle was George Everest, who had been the Surveyor General of India, and after whom the highest peak in the world is known. And his house still stands in Mussoorie, I believe. So she said in her essay, she said, George Everest used to come back to London quite so often, perhaps every summer. And he had his own salon where he would talk about all that he had learned in India. And Mary Boole writes that George Everest brought back to England the work of Navya Nyaya school, which had risen in Bengal and Bihar about 1,000 years prior, who had developed, according to all modern scholars of logic, who had developed the entire framework of mathematical logic, which is equivalent to mathematical logic 1,000 years prior. And so, according to Mary Boole, George Everest was the person who explained it to these three people in his salon. And what they did was to rewrite it in modern language. And that was another way Indian knowledge system has already transformed the world. But now let's come to what is it which is possible, um, or how do we position what we know of the Indian knowledge tradition. First thing that I want to mention is that something very tragic happened 70 years ago when India became independent. Prior to that, if you look at a great Indian scientists, C.V. Raman or J.C. Bose or S.N. Bose or Meghnad Saha, and certainly the amazing Srinivas Ramanujan, one of the greatest mathematicians ever, they were all connected to Indian tradition. They had been taught, in addition to Western science, they were also aware of what the Indian tradition was. For example, J.C. Bose, in a famous series of experiments, after he had done his revolutionary work on electromagnetic waves, and for many of you, it will come as a surprise that even though Marconi was the first guy to win the Nobel Prize in 1901 in physics for his work on transmission of electromagnetic waves, in the 1990s, IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which is the premier body, upon review of scientific evidence, concluded that it was J.C. Bose who did all this prior to Marconi. So as far as history of science is concerned, this other central development which has changed the world has an Indian person as a part of it, J.C. Jagdish Chandra Bose. I was last year meaning before COVID happened, late 99, I was in Calcutta at his home, which is now the Bose Institute, delivering the annual Bose lecture. So it was wonderful to see where he sat and had conversations with Rabindranath Tagore and others, and an amazing and inspirational thing. But now so we have Indian contribution here as well. But what happened 70 years ago, somehow people who led Indian science at that time decided that all of Indian scientific tradition would not be taught, or Indian Shastras, which are science, which are universal knowledge, would not be taught because they were declared as being religious texts. And since India was going to be a modern country, we would just be connected to modern scientific river, if you will. And I think that's been a great, great mistake for two reasons. First of all, these texts are not religious. They're not devotional, if that's what we mean by religion. They are universal. They talk about problems, for example, in Vaisheshik Sutra, Vaisheshik Darshan. They're about what is physical reality. And yoga, as we already know, is about, consciousness in the body coming together, which is now transforming the entire world. You go to any country, including Saudi Arabia, you'll see women doing yoga. Of course, the asanas, but the asanas are the doorway into deeper knowledge. Or you have Sankhya, which is enumeration of various categories associated with evolution or creation, both at the cosmic level and the personal level. At the personal level, of course, we're talking about the evolution of the cognitive system. And then you have Nyaya, which is logic. So Nyaya you have Sankhya and Yoga, Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Nyaya is analysis of language in terms of its atomic constituents, and Vaisheshika is analysis of the physical world in terms of its own atomic constituents. And then Sankhya and Yoga are likewise a pair. And then you have Mimamsa, on which Professor Pandey wrote. Mimamsa, which is analysis um, of ritual and different categories which we take in to understand our world at a individual level, and then Vedanta, which is a theory of everything, theory of reality. So we see that these are three pairs, which is as if we were standing in a cube and with six walls, right? In a cube, there'll be six walls, floor, the ceiling, and the four walls. And they describe these orthogonal views of reality. And they explain a lot. First of all, they provide insights which are not entirely identical. This is where Western science has hit a roadblock trying to create a unified theory, which is what Einstein did and which many other people have tried to do as well, ends up nowhere, because the central Upanishadic or Vedic perspective was that reality is para, it's transcendental, and our language deals with apara, which is relationship with properties of either abstractions or real things, which are materialistic or which can be associated with physical objects or conceptual objects. So reality is transcendental, it goes beyond, and therefore language would always be insufficient. Apara is always insufficient in describing um, um, uh, para, and that's why there can be paradoxes. Bhartrihari and many others, the Upanishads itself, saw these paradoxes, which have also been now discovered, for example, in the study of language, say by Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein and many others in the last 100 years. Brings us back to what Heinrich Zimmer wrote 70 years ago about how so much of what is now central to Western thought was a part of Indian thought at least 2000 years ago. It's incredible. You look at Upanishads, such inspirational stuff, which can sort of energize us to go and look at not only in this modern world at the beauty that lies in the material world, which we can explore by seeing different places and hiking and climbing mountains and exploring seas, but also the infinite capacity that lies in the explorations related to the inner world, which the West has not acknowledged until recently. And now they are trying to do so in this incipient, emerging science of consciousness, where scientists from many different fields are coming together, trying to see what can be done. So this is where this potential lies. And in physics, in philosophy itself, because philosophy was one of the central things, and in Indian thought, because through philosophical thought you sharpen your arguments, and then you approach material or ethical or cultural questions with that sharpened mind, because the mind ultimately is an instrument, which is truly correct. Antahakaran, it's an inner instrument, and you need to sharpen it through education. As Narad, for example, tells Yudhishthir that this is what the objective of education should be in the Bhagavatam, that the objective should be to sharpen one's thought. So what happened was that we in 1947, we abandoned all of Indian sciences. And then we also abandoned our own languages, because if you look at all successful nations like Japan, China, Korea, Sweden, Germany, any other, the sciences and all subjects are taught in the mother tongue. And which is not to say that one should not do English in India. English is wonderful too. You should teach English, and you should teach it very well. But where we made a huge mistake was not to teach other subjects in the mother tongue, because that led to a situation where our development of our intuition has been rather shallow, which is the reason why we haven't done so well in creative affairs in the last 70 years, in contributions in science or the arts or any other subject. Clearly, there's much more that was done when India was so much poorer off for for many historical reasons. We do know that prior to the coming of the English in 1800s or late 1700s, India's share of the world economy was 25 to 30%. By the time they left, the English left, in 1918, there's a big study. India's share of the world economy had shrunk to 1.8% from 30%. And then after the Second World War, when the English did allow, after a long time, India to develop some of its own factories, it probably crept up to 2.5% or so. And even now, it's hardly in the 5% range. So just imagine, economically, India was so much better off, even after centuries of warfare before the British came. So what we needed to do, or what we need to do now, this is of course just a recipe in passing, is to connect to the Indian sciences in a more organic way through our own languages, and which is not to turn our back on the West. We should also embrace the West, and English is wonderful. It's also helped us in the back office work, but back office work does not open the amounts of jobs, which is what some of the leaders of industry are saying, this is what we should do. We should have even more of English. I think it's a big mistake, because back office is going to shrink because of AI. What we need to do is to focus on products, which is what China and Japan and Korea and even Vietnam are doing. While what we've been too afraid to do it, and partly because we've lost self-confidence, because we are not connected back to our tradition, because of this these decisions that were taken 70 years ago, that India will not teach its own scientific tradition to its students. Because science ultimately, or creativity ultimately, it's not just facts. It's something much more subtle, which draws upon unstatable insights, which are a part of one's intuition. And for that, India, where we accept para, provides, and it's indeed true. Why we shouldn't accept para just because somebody has said it? But look at the story of look at creativity. Jacques Hadamard, a well-known French mathematician, 70 or 80 years ago, he did a poll. He wrote to the leading mathematicians of his time, and he asked them, how did you come by your great discovery? And most of them said, we made our discovery not by conscious thought. We either saw it in a dream, or we were in a daze, or it came spontaneously. So creativity, which is where one is truly connected to this infinite reservoir, which exists in each one of us, because it's the same consciousness. According to Vedanta, according to the Vedas, it's the same consciousness which is within each individual. It's like the outer sun mirrored in a million different pots of water. You see the same disk. So it's the same one consciousness mirrored in the machinery, the brain machinery of a billion or 6 or 10 billion sentient beings. So it's the same consciousness which reflects, and if your machinery, if that water has ripples, as Patanjali says, you have to avarodh them, you have to stop that. Vrittis, you have to be nirodh them. So you have to make it as calm as possible, because that's when you see all that brilliance completely reflected within you. And this is what Ramanujan used to say. As you know, Ramanujan was self-taught, and when he wrote to Hardy in Cambridge, Hardy was astonished at those equations because there was no mathematical background to them. And so he went over and he wrote many papers, and he died very young in his early 30s, 32, I think he was. So Hardy would ask him, how do you come by these equations? Because that's not how standard science is done, or standard any stuff is done. You have a body of knowledge, then you sort of play around with it and come up with something else, come up with something slightly different. He says, well, uh, his own family's Ishta Devi was goddess Namagiri or Namakal. And of course, one doesn't have to take it as a literal truth, but what he meant was that the goddess comes to him in his sleep or when he's lucid dreaming and dictates these formulas to him. Now, he died, I think, in 1920 or so, when he was 33. 50 years after his death, in the 1970s, his notebooks, when he was dying, in his last year or two, he fell very sick in England. He came back, and he scribbled on these notebooks. They were discovered by mathematicians, and in the last, since 1970s, the mathematicians have been working on them, and they're absolutely astonished. Where did these equations come from? So this sort of seems to conform to the Vedic idea that that consciousness works outside of just the process in the brain. It's sort of totally different from the notion that the egotistical, egocentric individual would say that, hey, I created this, I found this. The Indian view is that the goddess spoke through the individual. It's just the opposite way, that it's not you that you found it, but you became the right receptacle to receive this wisdom. And just as, that avataran that Krishna speaks of in the Bhagavad Gita, we become instruments uh, of consciousness, and that's what drives evolution of the world in a particular way. Now, modern India's greatest physicist was a good friend of mine. He passed away last year, George Sudarshan. He was a Malayali, but he's also a Vedantin. And in the 1970s, he wrote a very famous paper where he showed, and this looks at the problem of the interaction of consciousness and the material world. He showed that by observation alone, the observer can steer the state of a quantum system. Because, and this is something that was also a part of the debate within India centuries prior. And the debate was, how does the deity change the world? Because the Vedas also acknowledge that everything is according to rit, meaning laws. If everything is according to laws, then how can any imagined deity like Vishnu or Shiva or Saraswati or whosoever one might want to think of can change the world? Then the deity becomes superfluous. So as a counter to that, the rishis came up with this idea of what is called drishti srishti vada, which means that through drishti alone, srishti is done. Drishti meaning through observation alone. So what George Sudarshan and his student Misra discovered in 1970s in their famous paper. And this has been demonstrated to be true in lab experiments across the world, that through observation, you can steer the state of a system. And therefore, here is a mechanism, because after all, we've been looking for this mechanism. How do the two interact? So to come back, let me tie up all the loose ends. Where the Indian knowledge system, which is this whole conception of the world as an interplay of consciousness and materiality, uh, can come in, is that wherever sciences have reached a dead end, as in modern cosmology, where we are compelled to invoke dark matter and dark energy, 96% of it, we need to go back and look at the whole question of the observer afresh. And in fact, even Einstein in 1905 or 19 or prior to that, 1903 onwards, when he was a young man, what brought about the relativity revolution was to bring in the observer. And the moment you bring in the observer, the whole question of the speed of light being constant, etc., comes in, and that changes a lot of the stuff. But perhaps a relook is required in all of the science fields which have reached a kind of a dead end, cosmology, neuroscience, computer science, and that would be one big thing. But even going beyond that to humanistic subjects, humanistic sciences, politics, social science, how to deal with the emerging challenges and huge challenges that are there for entire humanity related to mass unemployment. As I mentioned, it's already upon us. I can speak of, let's say, the field of education with technology, the technology which is allowing all of us to talk and interact with each other across different continents. With technology, you can have a single studio or a set of studios in one place in the world, and all of the students could be listening to the lectures by these great professors at one time. So, what about all the millions of professors and teachers we have right now? What will they do? Where will their jobs go? If self-driving cars become a reality, and technologically they are already a reality, but once they start being employed, right now it's estimated that about 70% of all the jobs in a developed nation such as the US are related to transportation. If all of these jobs go away because of self-driving cars, then what will human beings do? What will these people who are displaced from their jobs will do? Now, many people, industry leaders and elites, are thinking about it. So what they are saying is that we will have a system of UBI, universal basic income, and everybody will be given, say, $500 in the US, um, for, say, US society, which is just enough for you to live, basically have a room, have subscription to Netflix, social media, and possibly liquor or drugs. Eventually people will do that, because unless you're very well together, if you believe only in your body, then you'll probably get addicted, as is already happening in the US. Did you know that last year 90,000 Americans, able-bodied, good-looking, in their 30s, with young children, many of them, because of their addiction to opioids, 90,000 of them died of overdose. This is a huge epidemic, and this epidemic is going to get worse unless this materialist view, which is the standard view, which is driving policy, which is also driving the neoliberal program of different policy interventions which have been adopted across the world, unless one goes beyond it, because this view has done some good, because the body is also a fact. You can't run away from the body and just say that this everything is mithya, jagan mithya. No, we're not talking that. I'm personally totally inspired by this other Vedantic view, which looks at the physical universe also as a body of Brahman, or Shiva. You have both Shiva as consciousness, and then the embodiment of Shakti as Vimarsha, and Shiva is Prakash. And Prakash and Vimarsh coming together is what occurs within each one of us. So I think this has the potential, in my view, of dealing with all these challenges, not only in India, providing us new ways of looking at both the scientific challenges, which are probably ultimately not as serious because science can wait or it can be slow or fast, but social challenges, which are going to be extremely enormous, in my view, as jobs go away. So we have to rethink everything, but we will be able to rethink all this only if we knew our own amazing, extraordinary Vedic tradition. We, strangely, 70 years ago, decided to uh, throw it out of the window. We need to embrace it. And this is what Professor Govind Chandra Pandey did in his work. Inspirational work, for example, his work on Buddhism. A lot of the stuff that Indologists have written over the last 100 or 200 years, which is what we have let ourselves be guided by, is superficial and wrong. Why am I saying it? The great Sri Lankan scholar of India, Ananda Kumaraswamy, wrote, I believe in 1920s or 30s, he wrote an essay where he says that literally everything that is written about Hinduism by Western scholars and their Indian followers is wrong. And I totally agree with that. We need to go back to these texts in a vital way. They are universal texts. First of all, they are not religious in the sense, in that pejorative sense that we ascribe to that word. They are universal texts, and we need to be connected to them. And we would then find many different resolutions related to social organization. And we need to go back and we need to question medieval interpretations as well. We need to go back to the original text, because just because somebody wrote something in Sanskrit 400 years ago does not necessarily mean that we got to accept it. We must go back, and the open-minded way in which the Vedic rishis looked at all of these questions is what we need to be connected to once again. And I have argued that instead of just the 6 Shad Darshanas, we need to go and enlarge it to 9 Darshanas, and the other 3 can be Spanda, the vibration associated with consciousness, can be Kala, the mystery of time, and finally Shaiva Darshan, where Shiva really is a name for consciousness. This is the frontier that modern science has come to, and everybody acknowledges it. And not just science, also medical science. Medical science itself is facing a crisis. Allopathy is facing a crisis because, and this is something that researchers know, 70 to 90% of all the clinical papers that are published in medical journals cannot be replicated. There's a huge replication crisis of medicine, psychology, and all these social sciences. And how do we reformulate these questions by bringing in the observer central stage, as the observer needs to be? And you can't treat the body without also thinking of the mind. Allopathy only treats the body, leaves the mind out, which is why it cannot explain placebo effect. Just by, if you're given a sugar pill, 34% of the cases people get better. In fact, they can also have side effects if they are given placebos, so long as they think that they are being given a medicine. So how does that happen? We need to bring back all of these sciences, and even Ayurveda does provide a place to mind. And also Ayurveda also does analysis in three categories. Modern math or logic has shown that um, ternary logic, or logic in three categories, is superior and more efficient to binary logic. So the manner in which well and not well dichotomy has been set up as a foundation of medical science probably needs to be relooked. And we need to make all of these vital sciences, and not just be connected to these samhitas that were written 2000 and 2500 years ago. All of this needs to be revitalized. And I think that'll be great, both for India and for the entire world. And perhaps we would not be talking of Indian knowledge system as something provincial, as something small, but as something which is universal. So with this, I stop. Thank you very much.